I've got a real issue here in relationship to to Paul. We have a map up here in front that you can study, and the more you look at it, it's going to take your eyes, it's going to go like this, because you see up there 4 different lines. And if you study them, there's a little chart down the bottom showing you the color code of what has happened with each one of the lives of Paul. Now, the reason David and I talked about doing this in Paul is that he is studying with all of us Romans, and Romans was written by Paul. And so a good thing to be doing in this case is to study the life of Paul to understand who the man was that wrote Romans and what went on in relationship to his life. Now, I want you to stop to think of something for just a moment. When Christ was on the earth, one of the things he told the disciples is this, and you're very familiar with this: go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. Did you get that? Into all the world. Now, he also said something else to the disciples: go to Jerusalem and wait. Wait. What happened to the disciples that the word wait never went any further? What happened that the disciples went to Jerusalem, they waited for the Holy Spirit, when it happened on Pentecost, and Peter got out and preached that marvelous, wonderful sermon. By the way, at the end of that, how many people were added to the church? About 3,000. A little bit later, it says in Scripture, 5,000 more. So the church was growing by leaps and bounds because these men were really, really, really doing the preaching and were convincing people. Now, the issue here is this: wait. And what did Jesus say to the others? Go. Why did the disciples keep staying in Jerusalem? Why did the little clan knit itself together and stay there and not go out and spread the word? I have a feeling that there was an awful lot of the fact that they were still Jews and strong Jews, and they were still of the impression that a person who became a Christian, especially a man, had to be circumcised, and that all the traditions had to be fulfilled. Because what did Jesus say? I came into the world to fulfill. And so they were still Judaized to the extent that they stayed home and they were taking care of the congregation. But there were some other things that were beginning to happen. There was a lot of persecution going on. And in this persecution, there were congregations here, there, and other places. In fact, we read that Philip left Jerusalem. He went up to Samaria, and he talked up there, and he preached up there. We know that the Ethiopian eunuch went back home. And I was told many times, I've read this and I've been told this, that in World War II, when soldiers went into Ethiopia, because see, at one time, the Italians during the World War II, they controlled Ethiopia. But the soldiers went down there and they found congregations of the Lord's church following exactly what it says in Scripture. And yet nobody had been down there. It's amazing what happens. We also know in relationship to these people that because of the persecution, there was groups of people going here, groups of people going there, groups of people going everywhere. So if they're going someplace, now, if you and I left and we went someplace, and we didn't have any knowledge of what the Bible tells us to do, I think there's some questions that would start coming to us. What are we supposed to do? How do we explain this? Where are we supposed to meet? What kind of rules and regulations are we supposed to follow? What is the issue? There was kind of a floating thought that was out in these congregations. They were out here like stragglers, and they were disorganized, and yet they would get together. In fact, we read that after Pentecost that the early church in Jerusalem came together, had all things in common, shared with each other, fellowship, and there was wonderful things, but we don't hear of anything going on in the other places, in this town, that town, any other town. And so God looks down, and just like when the children of Israel were in Egypt, and you remember when Moses was called by God, one of the things he asked God is this: why did you not go help them? And God told him, I am getting you ready to go help them. You're going to go. He said, I have heard their call. God has heard the call of these congregations of groups of Christians here, there, and everywhere. And he was preparing the way to bring order to the congregations and the churches. Did you ever stop to think in relationship to Paul and Moses, the parallel to those two people? Moses and Paul, or at this time still Saul, were both brought up by godly people. I'm talking about Moses while he was still a little baby for a short while. Both of them were trained in the greatest known institutions that their life could probably be put into. Moses being trained in Pharaoh's court, in the royal palace, and in the royal school. And we have Paul, trained by Gamaliel in Jerusalem under the greatest person ever trained in rabbinical law. We have both of these people who got involved in the killing of a person. We have both of these people who spend time in a wilderness. We have both of these people who are called by God. We have both of them that saw a light. And both of them, when the message was told, go do it, they both went and did what they were told to do. So here you have Paul, or Saul at this time. Saul is busy learning. And as he is learning the rabbinical law and being taught what has to be done with the Judaism, they got a real problem in the rabbinical organization. And the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the priests, the Sanhedrin, the whole batch of them were getting really, really annoyed. Now, maybe you never thought of this. What would the elders think in this congregation if next Sunday, now, we were blessed. Last Sunday we had a catch up and we went whoop, way over the top. But what would happen all of a sudden if every one of the offerings came in at $10, $15, $20? I mean, total. What if everybody here just said, I'm just going to give $1? Wouldn't the elders get together and say, what's going on here with this? Can you see the little box there in the temple where the people are supposed to walk in and put their tithes into that? And every day they go open the thing up and the thing gets less and less and less. Why? Because what did it say about the Christians? They were sharing with each other and helping each other. So if they were doing this, it probably was not going into the temple. And so the amount of income coming into the temple was beginning to fall. There's a good evidence, too, that if these people were becoming Christians, they were gathering together, it says, to fellowship and to strengthen each other. So when it came time to be in the temple, the crowds was going down. The attendance was dropping. The empty pews were everywhere. The thing was it was collapsing in on them. And there was an agony going on in there. And people were not doing what they were supposed to do. And so these Jews were beginning to look at this. And I could see them talking over and over, and this young man, Saul, who was a student in there. By the way, I think he was a real go-getter. I think he was an ever-ready battery. I think he was a type A person. I think he was a person that just couldn't sit down. He just had to go, 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 go. And everything that was hitting him was just aggressive. And he was listening to all these noises about what's going on. And there was a conclusion that was coming up. These Christians are at fault. The Christians are the problem. If we got rid of the Christians, maybe the temple would begin to get strong again. The people would come back. We've got to put a stop to this. He hears this message over. He hears it over. He hears it over again and again and again. And the more he hears it, the more he begins to grit his teeth. He grinds his teeth. He gets irritated. He gets agitated. He talks with other people. And there becomes a consensus. We've got to stop these Christians. These Christians are not doing what we want them to do. By the way, they weren't called Christians yet. What were they called? The Way. Those who were following the Way. They had gone astray, going the away, or the way. Now, I can just fathom that there was groups of people who were looking to who and what they could do something about. And then comes this person on the scene, Stephen. Stephen is preaching. Stephen is having a tremendous influence. And Stephen is really, really bringing people in. And so a group of radical Jews, rabbis, others get together, and Saul is one of them. They get him, and they get ready to stone him. You've read the story in the scriptures time and time again about how he told them, witnessed everything, and one of the things they said is that he said that he saw the heavens opened up and God sitting at the right hand, and that's when they gnashed their teeth. That was the last straw, and they began to pick up the stones and throw it at him. And as they began to throw it at him, who's standing there holding his cloak? Can't you see Saul? I got his coat. He doesn't have it on. And they start throwing those rocks, and that blood starts splattering, and pretty soon it gets onto him. And he gets himself in a mess, but he witnesses this whole thing. Now he gets to feeling strong. I mean, I've been a part of something big. This is going to slow this whole thing down in Jerusalem. Then he goes to the people in the temple, and he asks those in authority, look, gentlemen, I'll tell you what I'm willing to do. I'm willing to leave school for a while. I'm willing to leave the location here for a while. I understand there's a large congregation of these Christians up there in Damascus. I'll tell you what I'm willing to do. I'm willing to go up there with a group of guys, and we'll go up there and straighten them out. We'll put them in prison. We'll wrap them up in chains. We'll drag them back here. We'll have a trial. We'll go for this. And they pick up a piece of paper. They sign this whole thing because this is like his visa. This is his passport. This is his ability now to travel. He can go, and if somebody stops him, he's got the proof of why he is doing what he's doing. And I can see them going along the road and say, boy, wait till we get up there. This is going to be a big one. We're going to go up there and really bring these people back into the temple. We're going to clean house up there. But what's God doing in heaven? He's watching. He had a man called Saul that he has trained for years in the rabbinical law. That man has learned everything there is. He had a rational mind going for him that could interpret that law. He knew exactly what was going on with everything in the Jewish temple and among the Jews and among the priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. He was a Pharisee. His daddy was a Pharisee. He is a Roman citizen. He came to the city of Tarsus, but he had been there in Jerusalem studying all his young life, getting his PhD. He, in my opinion, was one of the smartest people that we have living during the time of the New Testament, just like I think that Moses was one of the smartest people living in the Old Testament. As he's walking along and going along, maybe on a horse, or I don't know, walking, whatever, all of a sudden, whoop! He couldn't see. He was blinded. A light came down, and he heard a voice. Saul, why are you persecuting me? How often in the life of people a light comes on and something warns us our life isn't the way it should be. And at that moment, the challenge of each of us is to look inwardly and ask, what are we doing wrong? And are we willing to turn ourselves around and face the truth? When that light shined and he was made blind, he was told to go to Damascus and wait. He didn't get any great big story, just go to Damascus and wait. Now if you look in this map up here, from Jerusalem down here below, you see Damascus up above? 3 days, people. 3 days he's blinded. 3 days he can't see. 3 days he doesn't eat. I mean, if I lost my eyesight just bang boom like that, I think that I'd have to do some examining of myself too and ask what's happened to this thing. Now, where's he staying? It says he stayed on the street straight. Isn't that interesting? He's going to be straightened out on the street straight. Isn't it interesting that he goes to the house of Judas? We had a bad Judas that turned around and betrayed our Lord. We have another Judas here that takes this renegade in and lets him live there for 3 days. And then somewhere else in town, and we don't know where in town this is, there's another man called Ananias. And Ananias gets a message that rocked him to the core. Ananias, there's a man, Saul, down the street straight in the house of Judas. I want you to go there, and I want you to deliver this message, and I want you to get him straightened out. I can see Ananias. I mean, if I would get a message like that to go to the Hell's Angels who ride motorcycles all over the place and carry their guns around, you think I'd want to go talk to them? No. But he got the message, and he knew that it came from God, and he goes. He went to the house, and he told Saul exactly what to do. And it says that Saul was obedient, and he was baptized. Immediately, his eyes opened up, and he was able to see. He not only got the light from seeing, he got a light in his heart. His whole life was changed on that moment. Now, you and I know this. This is why when a person is baptized for the remission of sins, they come up a new creature. Well, this is what happened to Saul. Immediately, he became a new creature. Now, watch the evolution of his head. He's been trained in the rabbinical law, one of the most fantastic, knowledgeable young men on the scene in rabbinical law, and immediately he goes into the temple and he starts to preach and to teach. He goes among the Christians, preaching and teaching. Can you imagine what they started to think? What's this traitor doing here? Is he coming to snoop on us? I bet he's looking around and he's taking notes. He's writing down everybody that's in this congregation. He's going to turn those around and take them back to the Pharisees, and they're going to come after us, and we got trouble going in our head. They didn't want him around. Nobody wanted him around. He was not somebody you could trust yet. Not a bit. What the disciples in town had to do with him, they had to take him out one night, put him in a basket, and leave him down on the outside. You see, when you have to save somebody, that's a good way to do it. We remember that in the story in the fall of Jericho, that a basket was put down and a group of people came down on a rope, and they were able to escape. Well, Saul has to escape. Now, where does Saul go? Acts doesn't tell us this, but you have to go into Galatians to read this. Saul goes back, and he goes all the way to Arabia. For 3 years. 3 years he studies, and he studies, and he meditates. And God is taking him and molding him. You remember what Jeremiah said in the 18th chapter? That we should be like clay in the hands of the potter. Now, a lot of you know that I used to be an art teacher, and I loved to do things on the wheel, and I would take that old wheel and spin the wheel and make it go around, take the clay and put it in there and make little vases and make little things. This is what God wants to do with that clump of clay. He's going to take Saul, and he's going to make him into Paul, and he's going to take that piece of clay and he's going to mold it. People, you and I have to be pliable. We have to be moldable. We have to let the potter, the Lord, take our life and make it into exactly what he wants. If there is one little flaw in your life, this is what happens in a piece of clay when your hands are moving on it. That little particle will hook on your hand, and immediately, whoop, the whole thing just goes. It just blows. It just breaks. It just goes to pieces. And you got to turn around and put the thing all back together and get it pliable and start all over again. This is what the Lord has to do with us. When we make a mistake, we have to come back and get the thing put right again. So God has to work with Paul for 3 years. You know, Jesus went into the wilderness. Moses went into the wilderness. Paul goes into the wilderness. After 3 years, he humbly comes back. He comes to Damascus. In Damascus, as they talk with him, he also realizes he needs to go back to Jerusalem and introduce himself to the apostles. I like to think of this in this way. Saul has just been hired by the CEO of a new corporation. Saul is going to change jobs. Saul is going to get a whole new set of manuals, a whole new set of people to work with, a whole change of completely everything. But Saul turns around and goes down to Jerusalem. He introduces himself. They talk this thing over. And you know what the disciples tell him to do? Go back home to Tarsus. You're really not welcome here. Just go back to Tarsus. Now, where's Tarsus? Look up there from Damascus, go up to Antioch, go over there to the Tarsus. That's his home. That's where he grew up. He stays there for quite a few years. While he's there, he molds himself from this radical person to a person of humility. He's now into the place that God has just about got him ready to use as a vessel that he can do something nice with. And then after quite a few times, there's something happening down there at Antioch. You see Antioch just below Tarsus over here on the side? There's a congregation there that is really, really growing. But they got a problem. They don't have a preacher. And so the preacher search committee is looking for a preacher to come to Antioch. And one of the fellows, Barnabas, I know just the guy that would do this. If we're willing to take a chance on him, I have faith in him, I'll stand behind him, I'll vouch for him, and I'll stand firm that this guy is going to do us a good job. And so he goes up to Tarsus and he says, Brother Saul, come down to Tarsus and preach. This is going to be your first assignment as a preacher. But come and do it. You see, there were Greeks coming into the congregation. And there were Jews that were still trying to follow the Jewish law. They were still crossing into this whole thing. And so Saul, becoming Paul, begins to preach. He begins to take the old rabbinical law and he pulls it apart strand by strand, and he turns around and injects Christianity into it, and he begins to tell the freedom of what Jesus had been preaching in all the times he was on earth. And bit by bit, he begins to have a tremendous impact on that congregation. The congregation grew and grew and grew. In fact, they grew so much that eventually, shortly, they became totally self-supporting. They were an autonomous group of people. Now notice this. They're not going down to Jerusalem to ask the disciples, what can we do? No. It's all happening right there inside of Antioch. Antioch was a totally autonomous congregation. And as they became strong financially and strong in everything else and growing in the faith, a group of the elders got together and they talked this thing over and said, you know what? We can support a missionary. Let's send Paul, and send him off on a missionary journey. And Barnabas says, I would like to go with him. And the congregation and the elders said, yes, let's send Paul and Barnabas and send them on a missionary journey. So there's a young guy in there, kind of like an intern guy, a young fellow that wasn't married and he didn't have any strings attached to anything. Can I go? I want to go along. John Mark. And they said, yes, we'll let you come with us. And so they leave. Where did they go? Watch this. You see the little island of Cyprus? Now, why did they go to Cyprus? Where was Barnabas' home? Cyprus. Where are all his relatives? On Cyprus. What's so interesting about him? When he became a Christian, it said he sold all his land and everything he owned, and he took it and brought it to the church and gave it for the distribution of those who were needy. Barnabas is a good man. with this good man, and they go back to their home community, he's able to introduce Paul to the congregations, and he's able to preach, he's able to teach, he's able to get things done. As they go across the island, they come to the very end there, at the one side of the island, and they ran into this nut who turned around and looked at him and says, I know who you are. And he harassed Paul continuously. And so one time Paul just had it right up to here. And he remembered what happened when Jesus struck him, blindness. He just said, I'll finish this guy off. You're blind. And immediately he had a tremendous impact on the congregations. Now, something is stirring up in Paul's mind too. We just came from Antioch, and I've seen a map, and way up here, there's another Antioch, way up there in about the middle of what is Turkey. You know, we had such good success in this Antioch, I think I'd like to go up there to that Antioch. And so he told Barnabas, and he told this to John Mark, and they agree, and they get on a ship, and they go up there to the port. When they get to the port, John Mark says, I want to go home. I want to go home. I don't know if he's homesick. I don't know if he got seasick. I don't know if the food wasn't going his way. I don't know if he just had it with these two older men. I don't know what it was. I want to go home. And so Paul and Barnabas leave him go home. And they go up through there and take a journey, going from here to there, different places, establishing congregations, having tremendous success, also having some failures, having people that turn around and harass them, had to shake the dust off of their feet. It was not easy, but they had success and they felt good. And finally they turn around and come back, and slowly they work themselves back again, and they come back and they want to go to Antioch. Why to Antioch? What happens when we put a preacher out in the foreign fields as missionaries? Don't they come back to us every year or every couple of years and give a report from the pulpit and tell what they're doing? And tell the elders what they're doing, because the elders are putting the money into them through the congregational giving? Well, this is what they're doing. They're coming back home. They want to tell what they have been doing and the success they are having. This success is just working fine. But here's another problem now. While we have been to these congregations, we have been running into a bunch of Greeks that are believing. And we've got a problem because the Jews don't want them in the congregation because the men haven't been circumcised. And the Jews are still putting up all of the old barriers of tradition. Can we get rid of that? Can we get this thing to understanding? And so they go back down to Jerusalem and they have a church conference. The disciples and Paul and Barnabas meet. And they struggle with this and they talk it over. And finally, when Paul pulls out and says, Peter, let me ask you something. Didn't you one time go and talk to Cornelius? Was Cornelius circumcised? No. Did the Holy Spirit fall on them? Yes. Did you baptize them? Yes. Paul, I get your point. I understand what you're saying now. Let's accept the Greeks as they are. Except for this one thing. Tell them that they are to eat none of the idol food. They are to eat none of the food that's been offered to idols, and they've got to behave and not do the lavish, ugly things that those Greeks are doing. They have to learn to live a godly life and be good. And so they wrote this out in a letter, and they told Silas, when these gentlemen leave and go on the next journey, I want you to go along, because I want you to be the person who is going to deliver the message and tell them exactly how they have to live and what will they accept and what won't be done. When they get ready to live on the second journey, boy, oh boy, do they got a problem on their hands. Barnabas says, Paul, I'd like to have our young friend John Mark come back with. No way. Nope. He pulled a trump on us. He turned around and left us once. I'll never do this again. And there was a massive split right then and there. That Paul and Barnabas, it was over. It was all over. Barnabas said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take John Mark with me because the man has potentials. I'm going to go back to Cyprus, and I'm going to become the local preacher there on that island, and I'll stay there and establish the churches. Well, since the congregation had already, down at Jerusalem, had already said, Silas, go along and take the letter and show it to the different people, Paul and Silas hook up. The two of them leave, and they go off on another journey. And they travel here, if you look here on the second journey, that heavy purple. This is a major trip that they're going to do. And as they get traveling up through Asia, and Paul and Silas really want to establish the churches, really want to go through there and strengthen everything. And as they're traveling along, he gets another one of these strange messages. Paul, way over there in Macedonia, they need help. Now, what's interesting about that? If you look at the water between the two of them, this separates Turkey from Greece or Macedonia. At that moment, we're going to be passing over into Europe. And so when the message came, go to Macedonia, they go to Troas. While they're at Troas, they meet up with a doctor, and Paul, who said different times that he had a thorn in the flesh, we don't know what it is, but he needed the help of a doctor. Not only that, this Dr. Luke was really a proficient writer. He was a fantastic note taker. He wrote down everything. In fact, to show you how he wrote down everything, go back and read Acts. Luke says on there, I wrote this that you may know. He wrote the whole thing on the relationship to the early church. He wrote the whole thing about Peter there. And then he turns around from about the middle of it on. He writes all this stuff about Paul. He takes meticulous notes and keeps this thing going. But the three of them now cross over in a boat, and when they land, they put their feet on Europe. If you ever want to give thanksgiving to God, this is the moment to thank God for what we have today. Because at that moment, God's go ye into all the world and spread the gospel starts. Because now he's in Europe. You and I are of European nationality, descendants. Wherever we came from, the gospel is now going. It is going. And he gets up to Philippi. Here's something else interesting about Paul. Every place he goes, the first thing he does is he gets out the telephone book, or I don't know what they use today, something else. Where's the local congregation? In that day, they would look for the synagogue. And he went to the synagogues. He went every place looking for people, but he gets into Philippi, and logically, there's nothing like that there. And he looks around and finally says, there's nothing here. And then he's down in the marketplace, and he hears some people say, there's a bunch of people that go down there along the river. They're down there worshiping. Paul says, we'll go. They went down the river, and immediately he starts preaching. And a fine business lady, a very wealthy business lady, Lydia, hears the gospel and is baptized. A whole change of events takes place from that moment on. And there was a little lady in there that was going around telling the fortune tellers. And Paul had to finally put a stop to her. And then he was thrown in jail for this. And you remember what happened at midnight? When you and I would be there in jail, why did they do that to us? And I wasn't guilty. By the way, Friday we were coming back from down at Destin, and we were going through Brantley. Did anybody know where Brantley is? What's Brantley noted for? Speed trap, isn't it? We had pulled into town just south of town as we were coming through there, and a nice big old black car went zooming past us with a Tennessee plates, and Becky says, watch, that guy's going to get it. Just within about a few minutes later, here's this big black truck with a whole bunch of blue lights, pulled him over and got him. Well, see, Paul's in prison. He's not grumbling. He's not griping. He is just singing away. And with all this joyful singing, there's an earthquake. All the chains fell off all the prisoners. Now what happens to the jailer? I got to kill myself. Why? Because he is going to be held legally liable for every single prisoner. And if any one of the prisoners escape, he's going to be killed anyway. Paul says, hey, jailer, don't do it. We're all here. Everybody's just sitting here waiting. Waiting? Why didn't they run out? Oh, my life has just been spared. What can I do to save myself? The door was open and Paul begins to preach. And it says that the jailer turned around, washed his stripes, cleaned him up, and he and his household were baptized because of the preaching he did. And the church there in Philippi is established. He went on to Thessalonica. He had good success in Thessalonica. He keeps on going, and he keeps on going. He goes to a town called Berea. And when he got there and started talking to them, the Bereans said, hold it, hold it, hold it. I want to get my Old Testament. I want to see if these things you're telling me. Well, yeah, I see here in Isaiah it says this about Jesus. I see that all this is there. Yeah, that makes sense. We believe. It says they were more studious than anybody else he ever ran into. From there, he turns around and he says, I want to go on, but he told Luke and Silas, you stay here for a while, but I want to go on down to Athens. He got into Athens. He walks around. Now, Becky and I have been there. We walked all of this. I can just see this in my mind as clear as can be. Here's an idol, here's an idol, here's an idol, here's an idol. Idols everywhere, 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 everywhere. And then he comes across one with nothing on it. And there's a little thing on there that says, to the unknown God. See, they're afraid they're going to hurt somebody, hurt the God, so they turn around and put one to the unknown God. Then he meets up with the Stoics and he meets up with the Epicureans, and they said, hey, mister, come over to Mars Hill. Now, I've climbed Mars Hill. I've stood up there on that thing, and I can just see him standing there with all these people all around him, and he begins to open the gospel to them and preach. Paul, you're a babbler. What's a babbler? It's a little tiny bird that goes around, always making a noise and making nothing out of it. So he called him a babbler. It says in there that there were very few people, but there were some converts while he was there. From there he turns around, he goes back to Ephesus, and then it's time, he goes to Corinth, and he has a fantastic life in Corinth. He's there for about a year and a half. Now, we've walked the streets in Corinth, and we've stood right there where the synagogue was, because it's still all marked, and the ruins are all there. He had one of the most successful times in Corinth that he had any place. But he lands up finally, he goes back home again. And when he goes down to Jerusalem, he runs into another little buzzsaw. When they were going in there to sit down to have a fellowship meal, some of the Greeks that came into the meal sat down, and Peter and some of the other apostles got up. We'll go sit over here if you're going to sit over there. Paul had to turn around and say, look, look, look. This is not what Christ was preaching. This is not the way it should be. You cannot segregate yourself like that. Greeks and Jews must learn to live together. We must all get together. Christianity is a message to everybody, for all people at all times. But he goes back. I'm going to run out of time. From there on, he takes another short journey, but later he comes back again, and on the third journey coming back, he was told twice, don't go back to Jerusalem for the Passover. One time, Philip's 4 virgin daughters told him, don't go back. They were prophesying. Another time, Agabus pulled his belt off, tied it around him, and says, you're going to be made a prisoner. And logically, when he got down to Jerusalem, he went to the temple. And a bunch of the people turned around and said, why did you bring those Greeks into the temple? They're okay. No, they're not. You shouldn't let them in the temple. And so in turn, a riot broke out. And out of this riot, he is arrested. He told the people the truth about what he was doing, but he had to take a vow. He had to shave his head, so he and I must have looked pretty much alike for a little while. But he shaved his head, and he took this vow. But then, as he was made a prisoner, he had to go before the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and argue and talk. And he saw that the Pharisees are fair people who believe in the resurrection. The Sadducees are sad people who don't believe in anything. And so he played the two of them together, and he got them to arguing. And finally, he was taken to the prison. And from the prison, I have to jump this story and go fast now. He got a message from his sister's son that he was going to be killed. A group of Jews had taken a vow, we will not eat until he is killed. And so they had to turn around and put him 270 soldiers to take this one man up to Caesarea. And from Caesarea, and the reason they go there because that's the only port in all of Israel. From there they turn around and they head off and they're going to go to Rome. Now during the time of going to Rome, they had to switch ships. They get into a storm like you can't believe. Now there again, Becky and I were on Malta when one of those storms hit up. And the news came on that a great big freighter had just been taken down and gone forever. So this is true. I mean, these kind of storms just hit when the two classes bang together. It just causes nothing but terrible, terrible things in the Mediterranean during the winter. If you remember the time when he got into Malta, he turned around in relationship to the snake, and he did not die. He later on was able to get on another boat, and he went to Rome. When he got to Rome, he was put under house arrest. He was there for a couple of years. It was there, dear people, that he wrote many of the epistles. Now, in closing, I challenge you with this. Take your Bible out and read the 4th chapter of 2 Timothy. That is the last words that he wrote when he was in the Mamertine prison. And dear people, Becky and I would both agree, you don't want to be in the Mamertine prison. You go to this Catholic church, you go down through a door, you go all the way down into the pits. It is slimy, it is ugly, it is a part of the sewage system. It stinks, rats around there, it's a mess. That's where Paul was, but with a grate up there, he writes the last part of 2 Timothy. And you read the 4th chapter, and you can see a man who just in a little while, Nero is going to take him outside of the gates, and there's a great big church there called St. Paul's Cathedral. And they put his head on a place, bam! For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me.